Murder, She Said is a 1961 film directed by George Pollock and was adapted from the Agatha Christie novel 450 from Paddington. It stars Margaret Rutherford in her first appearance as Miss Jane Marple. While on a train, Miss Marple witnesses a murder take place on another train traveling next to hers. But when no body surfaces, the police chalk it up to the imaginings of a mystery novel-obsessed elderly woman. Determined to discover what happened, Miss Marple goes undercover to figure out just what's going on at Akenthorpe Hall. I mentioned in my last Miss Marple review that I was intending to start the Joan Hickson series next, but I managed to track down the Margaret Rutherford quadrilogy in the meantime, and they looked like so much fun that I decided Joan Hickson will have to wait. Although, since we're talking about Murder, She Said, I did get a little preview of Miss Hickson, but we'll get to that. I knew going in that this series is known for being quite comedic, which I'm all on board for, but what I wasn't sure of was how the Marple character figures into that. And in particular, I didn't know what to expect from Margaret Rutherford. Just looking at the movie posters, she's very heavily caricatured. They kind of give the impression this might be a slapstick-heavy, somewhat goofy portrayal of the character. And it's really not. Margaret Rutherford was excellent in the film. She's a very unique-looking woman. Her demeanor and facial expressions aren't always what you'd expect, but she never goes over the top. So in that way, the advertising for these films doesn't really do her justice, because you see what looks like a rather ridiculous-looking character, but the performance is so far away from that. This is still a very grounded Marple, but different from the ones I've seen so far. I should mention that in comparison to the book, the first main difference is that Miss Marple witnesses the murder herself, rather than it being a friend of hers. And also, in the novel, I believe a young friend of Miss Marple's is sent undercover as a maid, but here, Marple does it herself. And both of these changes just demonstrate the main contrast between the Rutherford version and the others I've been watching. This Miss Marple is very active and involved in the mystery and the story. This is not some dotty old woman, as she likes to decry. If there is a job that needs doing, she is going to do it herself. There's no sending out the younger generation to do the legwork. And it's very impressive because Margaret Rutherford doesn't look to be someone so eager to throw herself into a potentially dangerous situation, but she does and is very convincing. This Marple also seems to be investigating her first mystery ever in Murder, She Said, at least based on the conversation she has with the village librarian, Mr. Stringer. Incidentally, Mr. Stringer is played by Stringer Davis, Margaret Rutherford's real-life husband. That relationship is very funny, Mr. Stringer being a much more timid and less adventurous sort than Miss Marple. In particular, the scene where the two of them go on the hunt for evidence alongside the railway tracks was hilarious. They're both dressed in these matching, unusual costumes, and Miss Marple helpfully says, "No one would give a couple of track layers a second glance." The idea and the sight of Miss Marple in disguise was just perfect, and further sums up this unique interpretation. Also, she golfs. She arrives at Akenthorpe Hall with a golf bag slung over her shoulder, and I wasn't sure why until she uses some golf swing practice as an excuse to explore the grounds. And also, a good driver is apparently a nice defensive weapon when a murderer is afoot. But besides being quite daring and determined, this Miss Marple is still a somewhat fearful, almost meek older woman in certain scenes. The times where she is nervously walking through the house during a power failure or venturing out to the carriage house to find the body that she's certain is hidden there show that she isn't quite as confident as her tough exterior would have us believe. And Margaret Rutherford makes that side of the character very believable and even brings out a hint of suspense as we're watching. James Robertson Justice is also in the film as Old Man Akenthorpe, and I thought he was quite good as well. He had a lengthy career, and I've seen him in a number of movies, but what I remember him best for is his portrayal of Little John in Disney's Story of Robin Hood and His Merry Men from 1952. His character here reminded me of Mr. Raphael from A Caribbean Mystery, the last Marple movie I had watched. Again, this is an at different turns shouting, then grumbling older man who seems at once the least happy and the most satisfied when he is trading barbs with Miss Marple. I enjoyed their banter, and if that sort of relationship between Marple and a grumpy old man is typical in more of these stories, I'm all for it. Arthur Kennedy shows up as the local doctor, and if there was a reason given for an American man working in this small British town, I must have missed it. He wasn't bad, it's not a very showy role, but he's good as part of the ensemble. Ronnie Raymond plays Alexander, a young boy that is part of the Akenthorpe family. I think he was a lot of fun playing this precocious troublemaker. He and Margaret Rutherford play off each other really nicely, actually, and his character is one of the few at the house that realize early on that something is off about this new maid of theirs, and she might have ulterior motives for taking the job. I have to mention Joan Hickson as well, playing a part-time housekeeper of sorts that also works at Akenthorpe Hall. While I haven't started her series yet, it was still fun seeing her and Margaret Rutherford share the screen together. Similar to Peter Ustinov's 13 at Dinner, where he and David Suchet got to work together, it's really fun to look back on and see two different generations of actors who are famous for the same roles. But performance-wise, Joan Hickson was very interesting, and it makes me so curious to see her Marple. I'm sure it will be a very different type of acting and performance, but here she's this kind of miserable, suspicious of others character who doesn't seem to have a lot of use for Miss Marple, or anyone really. For the rest of the cast, most of the other suspects show up quite late in the film, among them Thorley Walters, Ronald Howard, Gerald Cross, all playing either sons of Akenthorpe or those married into the family. For a different detective tie-in, Ronald Howard played Sherlock Holmes in the 1954 series that ran for one season, and he was also the son of Leslie Howard. This whole movie is not very long, and when all of these additional characters arrive well into the movie, it doesn't give a lot of time for them to be well-defined or differentiated. I would have liked there to be a little more establishment of these characters, but I'm assuming I'll have to turn to the book for that. As is usual for Agatha Christie stories, there is of course more than one murder. The frequency of dropping bodies picks up as we move along, but the one that starts everything off was great. That opening scene was altogether really well done. We see Marple board the train and take her seat, it's speeding along on the tracks, and we start to see other people on the train beside hers. We get brief little vignettes of funny moments that she's observing, and it's all very light and comedic. And then the next window passes, the blind goes flying to the top, and a woman is being strangled. It really caught me off guard, even though I suspected it was coming. It is the inciting incident of the plot, but it was a nice shift in tones, and that train whistle standing in for her scream, fading out as the woman dies, was perfect. A couple other stylistic choices that really stood out was some of the cinematography. I really liked the shot of the boy, Alexander, carrying the compact into the room full of suspects. We get this great POV shot over his wrist, following the compact as it gets closer to the people sitting around, and then they're turning around and staring at it. It was really nice. Also, the staging of the scene where the murderer is unmasked was executed very well. It involves a mirror and very particular placing of a chair, and I thought it was just really well shot, and also performed really well by both Rutherford and the killer. Don't want to spoil anything. It was a great climax and was a fun contrast to the usual gather the suspects and reveal everything type of scene. This instead is just Marple taking on a murderer in a room alone, and the sudden panic when the hands are around her neck was quite tense. But even besides those couple standout moments, I just really like the look of the movie. It very much has the feel of typical late 50s, early 60s, black and white, widescreen cinematography, and by that I mean I really enjoy it. I've said it before, but that style is so crisp and clean looking, and the same can be said here. The location shooting in England was quite picturesque, especially those brief moments where we're outside Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead. I've never pictured a creek or small river flowing right past her house, but it was a good look. I also have to mention the score by Ron Goodwin, and I absolutely loved it. It's a very peppy, playful, fast-paced score, and it fits the movie so well. It also matches this energetic spirit that we see in Miss Marple and creates a wonderful atmosphere. The main theme actually reminded me somewhat of the theme to Secret Agent or Danger Man. That theme, High Wire by Edwin Astley, has always been a favorite of mine in terms of spy TV, and both have that lively pacing to them. And for a different comparison, the music here wouldn't seem out of place in a Don Knotts comedy from the 60s either. If anybody hasn't seen The Ghost and Mr. Chicken yet, you've got to change that. I believe Ron Goodwin is behind the music on the next 3 of these films as well, so I can't wait. Something I'll mention is trying to guess the killer in these films. I really try not to do that, but as I've mentioned in a past review, there's this habit of making one of the higher profile co-stars the murderer. So I started to wonder about that early on, long before I had any actual evidence that the movie had presented to me. Was I right? I won't say. It's kind of like the big name celebrity guest star usually being the murderer in Columbo or Murder, She Wrote. I mean, in Columbo, you know who done it from the beginning, but you know what I mean. So, Murder, She Said was a lighthearted mystery that was so much fun, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. If you're a stickler for accuracy in comparison to the books, you're going to be disappointed. I think that's a running theme for the whole Margaret Rutherford era. They just use the stories as a rough guideline, but I'm not that concerned about that. Highly recommended. Thanks so much for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, please check back to my channel as I'll be continuing down this Miss Marple journey for quite a while yet. Adios for now.